Welcome to Lore Worst Game, where we see if legendary figures really match their video games counterparts. Today, we'll be looking at Io from Persona 3 and how well the game adapts these tragic tales of suffering, resilience, and transformation to its mechanic and the characters of Yukari Takeba. Io was a young maiden from Argos, the daughters of the river gods Inachus. She served as a priestess in the sanctuaries of Hera, the queen of the gods. However, her life was about to change forever. One day, Zeus, the ruler of Olympus, caught sight of her and immediately fell in love. But because he was already married to Hera, he approached Io in secret, arranging their meeting away from prying eyes. Yet after only a few encounters, Hera's suspicion begins to grow, and one day she decided to follow Zeus when he slipped away. Realizing he was being followed, Zeus panicked and transformed Io into a beautiful white heifer to hide her from his wife. Despite this desperate disguise though, Hera was not deceived, but instead of calling him out directly, she cleverly demanding the heifers as a gift. Reluctantly, Zeus could not refuse her and handed Io over. Once in Hera's possession, the goddess placed her under the guard of Argus Prometheus, a giant watchman whose body was covered with countless eyes. And because a few eyes always remain open, even while he's asleep, escape became impossible. But not all hope was lost just yet. Feeling responsible for Io's suffering, Zeus eventually sent Hermes to rescue her. But Hermes could not simply overpower Argus in a direct fight, so he devised a clever plan. He begins to play music on his flute, slowly lulling the giant to sleep. Once all the eyes were finally closed, Hermes struck without mercy. With the watchman gone, Io was freed at last, or at least. But it's not over yet. Hera, enraged by Io's escape, unleashed a new torment. She sent a giant gadfly to sting Io, who was still a heifer, relentlessly harassing her day and night without rest. The creature's attacks were constant, leaving Io in unbearable pain and driving her into madness. With no peace to be found, Io begins to wander the world. She crossed seas and continents. Her desperate wandering eventually brought her to Egypt, where she was reunited with Zeus, who restored her to her human form. At long last, her torment ends, and she remained in Egypt, where some account even claim that the Egyptian came to honor her as a goddess, giving her story yet another layers of transformation and survival. But how do the Persona developers take this story and turn it into a design that represents Yukari Takeba? Well, that's where things get really interesting. In Persona 3, Io served as Yukari's first and primary partner in battles, and her design is immediately striking. At first glance, you see a dark or perhaps tense figure chained inside the hollow head of a massive, beautiful white heifer. Long, lush lashes frame the eye of the heifer, making sure that you, the player, know that this cow is a cutie. This imagery clearly reflects the myth of Io, who was transformed into a cow, while the chains represent not only her imprisonment inside that body, but also the ongoing conflict between two of the most powerful gods in the Greek pantheons. The figures inside is restrained, with her posture hunched, eye closed, and mouth absent. A visual reminder of captivities. It's captured the essence of Io myth, forced into a situation she has no control over, silenced and made powerless in a struggle that was never her choice. Interestingly, in-game compendium described Io as a priestess of Hera in Greek myth, who was changed into a cow and guarded by Argus, only to be freed by Hermes. She fled across the sea to safety. It's concise and it's point directly to the most popular version of the story. However, I'd like to share with you some detail from other retelling that Persona left out that will make the connection between Io and Yukari more clear. One particular overlooked piece of the myth involved her meeting with Prometheus during her tormented journey. At that time, Prometheus was chained to a rock by Zeus as punishment for giving fire to humanity. The two prisoners converse, and Prometheus told Io that if she kept moving forward, she would eventually regain her livelihood, build a healthier relationship than the one she had with Zeus, and even have a family she could love. This left out part reflects Yukari's own story beautifully. Just as Io was told to endure her pain and kept moving forward, Yukari also begins her journey weighed down by grief and mistrust after the loss of her father. Her relationship with her mother has broken down, leaving her feeling isolated and unwilling to rely on anyone else. At the start of Persona 3, this transformed her into a guarded version of herself, someone who keeps others at a distance out of fear of being hurt again. But as the story unfolds, Yukari is pushed to confront those changes. She had to learn that while every relationship carries a risk of disappointment or betrayal, the alternative, a life with no one to rely on and no one to trust, is far more painful. Another small but fascinating detail appears in the middle of the heifer nostril, a carved symbol of Taurus from the zodiac. It's easy to miss, but once you notice it, the reference becomes clear. There's a two possible connections here. The first is straightforward, as the Taurus constellation is linked to Zeus, who famously took the form of a magnificent white bull when he abducted Europa, a Phoenician princess. That said, we won't dive into that full story today, but it's enough to say that the Taurus engraving on Io can be read as a brand, a mark that these heifers belong to Zeus. The second connection requires looking at astrology. In astrology, Taurus is ruled by the planet Venus, or Aphrodite in Greek myth, the goddess of love and beauty. At first glance, this might feel like a stretch, but within Persona, it somewhat makes sense. Io and Yukari Arcana is the lover, the same arcana tied to Venus. And while the lover arcana is often misread as simply about romance, its broader meaning is about relationships in general. Choices, decision, and the effort to build or rebuild bonds of trust. This interpretation fits Yukari perfectly, as much of her story revolves around rebuilding her relationship with her mothers and slowly learning to trust those around her again. Mechanically, Io specializes in wind magic and basic healing, which gives Yukari a supportive role in party right from the start. She's one of the few early game personas that manage to balance both offense and recovery, making her a reliable teammate when resources are still limited. At the same time though, Io also have the weakness to electricity, a detail that loosely echoes her connection to Zeus, the god of thunder and lightning. That said, when it's come to gameplay design, Io abilities lean much more towards serving the needs of the party than following her original myth. There isn't any direct traditional linking Io to healing powers or to the elements of winds. Her theurgy, Cyclone Arrow, reinforces this game's first approach. It's a high damage wind attack against a single enemy that even bypasses resistance. It's strong, but again, not rooted in the mythology. And I want to make something clear here, because this is important for how I approach this video. While I'll spend a lot of time pointing out where the dev take inspiration from the myth, I completely understand that the game balance and design have to come first. A perfectly faithful adaptation of lore wouldn't work if it broke the gameplay. So most of the time when I highlight these differences, it's not really meant to be a hard criticism. It's more about appreciating the way the myth and the mechanic meet halfway. Still, there is one really strong lore connection that show up in Io progression. Later in the game, she evolves into Isis, and depending on which retelling you look at, there's a version of the myth where Io eventually arrives in Egypt, starting a new life there, and becomes associated with the goddess Isis. Some accounts even describe her as Isis outright, while others frame it more as an identification, as if Io was believed to be an incarnation of Isis of some sort. And now that you have heard the lore and the connections, it's time for the verdicts. Io myth show us a maiden transformed into a heifer, chained and silenced by forces far greater than herself. In Persona, those details carry through. The chained figure inside the cow's head, the compendium entry that nod to her imprisonment, and even the hidden Taurus engraving that link her back to Zeus. The game also pulls in the lesser-known meeting with Prometheus by mirroring Yukari's struggle with grief and mistrust, creating a subtle with meaningful reflection. Where Persona takes more freedom is in its mechanic. Wind and healing skill do not come from the original myth, and her deity is designed purely for gameplay balance. But this isn't careless adaptation. Her eventually evolution into Isis echoed the Egyptian connection from her wandering myth, showing that the dev did not ignore her full journey. Instead, they chose the most fitting pieces of lore and used them to shape both Yukari characters and Io design. Verdicts: Faithful Tribute. Now this episode is actually planned as a two-parters. The next video, I will cover Isis in full detail, exploring both her myth and how Persona adapt her roles. If you want the complete picture, make sure to subscribe so you'll be notified when part 2 is released. And if you would like early access, you can become a channel member today and unlock the Isis episode right away. Otherwise, I'll see you next time when lore and games meets.